We've seen you here before, Ruchir. So, it's my pleasure to introduce Gurcharan Das, who many of you know as a writer. He actually studied philosophy at Harvard, and then he was the CEO of Procter & Gamble before he took early retirement to devote himself to full-time writing. But he was already a writer. You know, in his 20s, he wrote 3 plays. In his 30s, he wrote a novel, A Fine Family. And many of you will know his books, The Difficulty of Being Good and India Unbound. And his most recent book is India Grows at Night, A Liberal Case for a Strong State. Gurcharan also has one of the finest collections of art that I've seen. So over to you, Gurcharan.
Thank you. Thank you. It's indeed an honor to be here. And we are going to converse this morning about the India story. Is it over as growth has plunged from almost 9% to 5.5%? And where are we headed? And what do we need to do to get growth back on track? I am Gurcharan Das. 12 years ago, I wrote a book called India Unbound, in which it was the first book that predicted the economic rise of India, and many people at that time thought that I was smoking something. I'm pleased to introduce to you 2 very exciting panelists. A few years later, Ed Luce followed up with a wonderful book, In Spite of the Gods, in which he explained that India was rising despite the government, that it was a story of private success and public failure. More recently, Ruchir Sharma, who, by the way, is a local boy from Jaipur, but now the very high-powered head of emerging markets and global macro at Morgan Stanley in New York. And by the way, Ed is a half-local boy because he's married to a Bengali, but now is the head of the US Bureau of Financial Times, which he was covering here in India before. So more recently, Ruchir has looked at India from a comparative perspective and has dwelled on what it takes for a nation to get sustainable growth. So what does it take for a nation to, what does it take a nation to become a breakout nation, as he calls it? And so breakout from stagnation and to long-term prosperity. So I'll start with you, Ruchir.
Sure.
Well, is the India story over? Can India become a breakout nation? And what will it take?
Great. I think that as far as this term breakout nation is concerned and what exactly I mean by it, my entire point was that if you look at the global economy over the last 30 to 40 years, there are countries which do well for a short period of time, and then those countries, sort of fade away. So if you look at the countries which were the economic stars in the 1950s and 1960s, they included countries such as Iran, Iraq, even Saudi Arabia, even Pakistan figured somewhere in the 1960s, and look what happened to them. So economic success is very difficult to sustain. And what I try and do in this book, which is an economic travelogue, is to go around the world looking at various emerging markets and figuring out which will be the markets which will surprise on the upside over the next 3 to 5 years, and which are the markets which will disappoint over the next 3-5 years, maximum up to a decade. And as I've said often, and even in the book, that the time horizon I sort of care about is what most practical people care about, which is a time horizon of about 3, 5, maximum up to a decade, because anything longer than that to me just does not matter because of the fact that as I said, that the old rule of economic forecasting used to be that you make as many forecasts as possible and you remind people when you're right. The new rule of forecasting is you make forecasts so long out in the future that none of us will be here to know whether we were right or wrong. And I think that this is the fundamental flaw today when we talk about these projections about 2050, 2030. So when it comes to India, this is one sort of country, maybe I'm too close to it, but I'm slightly equivocal about, which is that I feel that the chances of India being a breakout nation are 50-50. And by that what I mean is the prospects of India beating expectations are about 50-50. And I think expectations are key, because as we know in India, that if the country grows at 5%, you may say 5% is not a shabby growth rate given what's happening in the global economy. But after we got used to growth rates of 8 to 9%, 5% in India feels like a recession. And the slowdown felt that way. And also the fact that our per capita income is so low, at only $1,500, that we need much faster growth to catch up with the more developed countries. So I think on India, that's the message. But the good thing is that I find that expectations out of India have come down significantly. A decade ago, the expectations were low at about 5-6% when you wrote your book, as you mentioned, and then we got a near decade of 8 to 9% growth, which is what created this sort of India miracle kind of narrative. And then now as growth has come back down to 5-6%, that's leading to a lot of disappointment among people, because they got used to this sensation of us growing at such a rapid pace.
Right.
So I think that India can still be a breakout nation, but the expectations need to be recalibrated, and also the fact that now we know that we cannot put this on autopilot, that this rising tide of global liquidity which lifted all boats over the past decade, that era is over. We need to sort of row our own boat now, and in this environment, it's much more about what we are doing at home rather than just relying on global factors to lift us.
So what will it take
Yeah.
to become a breakout nation for us now?
Yes, that's right. So I think that what I've done in the book is sort of come up with about like a bunch of rules of the road, that these are the factors you look for. And this regard, I think that one thing that we're doing now, which I think is correct, which is if you look at India, it's really interesting, which is every 10 years we face some sort of a macroeconomic crisis. And that macroeconomic crisis gives the country and the policymakers the impetus to launch some sort of reforms. And the good news is that's what's happening now, in terms of that we are once again not taking our growth for granted. Our focus is not just on welfareism and redistributing the pie, but it is now on taking the country forward. So in terms of what we should do now, I think in terms of further sort of opening up the economy, further liberalization, I think those are the kind of factors which matter, but also some basic stuff. We got to get our government spending under control. We can't keep writing checks which the exchequer cannot cash. And I think that that sort of mindset change, to me, is the single most important factor to make us a breakout nation.
Ed, now you were here for many years, and I remember the lovely walks we used to take in the afternoons in Lodi Gardens. And now for the last 5 years, you've been away, obsessed with American politics. You've written a new book, a wonderful new book about America. With this distance from India, how do you see the India story today? Is it still in spite of the gods?
It's actually 7 years.
7 years.
Since I was last based here, so I feel increasingly fraudulent actually talking about India. I hope Willie Dalrymple isn't here, because he did pay for me to come over. 7 years. In the last 7 years, I've just read yesterday, my own country, the UK, hasn't grown. The economy in the UK is exactly the same size today as it was in 2006. The Indian economy is about 3/4 larger. It's about 75% larger than it was in 2006. Of course, this isn't comparable. The UK is a developed country. It can afford to stagnate for a generation without real hardship kicking in. And India is a country where huge hundreds of millions of people still live on $1.25 a day. So it's not comparable. But that's one of the reasons why I'm still fairly optimistic about India's capacity, its ability to regain higher than 5% growth rates, because it's quite easy to do. It's not easy to grow if you're developed. It's pretty easy to make another 2% of the country literate each year or each 2 or 3 years, it's pretty easy to make roads which aren't potholed. It's pretty easy to develop water systems that pipe water into homes 24 hours a day if you have the will to do it. So I think the core question that I come back to, but that I was obsessed with 7 years ago, and that you are clearly obsessed with too, because your most recent book, India Grows at Night, is on that subject, is the capacity of the state to deliver these basic services, basic human soft infrastructure that is essential for an economy with 1.2 billion people to actually thrive. If you're not building all-weather roads to villages, if you're still unable to do that, if you're still unable to get teachers turning up at school, more than 50% of teachers showing up, if you're still unable to build the most basic sort of facilities for urban hygiene, then this tells me two things. One, the state is the core of the problem, but it's also the core of the solution. You can't get, the Ambanis are not going to do this. The state is going to do this, and it has to do this. So that's really the core, for me, the core question.
And before we come to the answer to that question, that why don't we then do it? If it's so easy, why don't we do it? Let me ask another question to both of you. And that is, you know, here's a nation which has amazing religious freedom. It has amazing political liberties. The press is vigorous and free. And Indians in the last decade, particularly the young, in the last 2 decades, I mean, half of India is a country which has never known an India that was not reformed. They're a generation after 91, and their minds are really free. Why does this country find it so hard to give its people economic freedom? Why must India rank with such religious freedom, so much political freedom? Why does it rank 119th on the Freedom Index? And why do reforms, why are reforms done through stealth? When particularly 3 out of 5 Indians is self-employed, means they are entrepreneurs, whether they're slumdog millionaires or what.
Right.
But they're people who work the streets and they hustle. Why does it take 42 days to get a license to start a business?
Right.
Any thoughts?
Ruchir can start. I'll follow up.
Yeah. You know, like 2 points. I think, you know, like on Ed's point that it is absolutely true that it's theoretically easy to grow from a low base. So that should be India's sort of strongest point at $1,500 per capita income. But here's the staggering statistic. There are about 180 odd economies in the world today which are tracked by the IMF. Only 35 are developed. Everyone else is emerging. So this, you know, like it appears theoretically easy, but very few countries are able to capitalize on it. So look at the example of countries in Latin America, Brazil, Mexico, or other countries. They have one good decade of growth, then they sort of get lazy, they fritter away the gains, and they're back to ground zero. So their per capita income has done nothing for 40, 50 years, even though theoretically it should be easier for them to grow. So I think the one thing we have to understand is theoretically it's easier to grow, but very few countries convert that potential into actual economic success. Very few do. Regarding India's point in terms of what's holding us back, I think the question is very relevant. I think it's got to do with the way that we sort of evolved in our post-independence history, which is that we evolved as a heavily centralized state, that the fear, especially in the times of the Nehru Gandhi, Indira Gandhi era, was that this country was going to break apart. So this fear of sovereignty, I think, is what led to a heavily centralized model in India, where the entire economic power was concentrated at the center in the name of keeping the country together.
And it was also a socialist age.
Yeah, it was a socialist age across the world, in fact. Many countries were sort of following that. But apart from that, it sort of kept, I think this fear of sovereignty is something which kept this country as a heavily centralized state. And this is not the natural social fabric of India. Right. And this is where these comparisons with China are greatly flawed.
Yeah.
That, that China is a monochromatic kind of society. It sort of grows together. we are really, the idea of India to me is really one which is like Europe, which is that it's a collection of federal states which are very diverse because of religion, caste, languages. So I think the natural social fabric of India is one which is a collection of 28 countries or states, so to speak. And I think that that's the way that India will grow, and that's the model which we're evolving to.
And that's what we were actually talking about yesterday, about really India being a weak state and a strong society. And in some ways, after 91, we have returned back to that sort of
We are trying
model.
to. I think it's a gradual process.
But we still find it so hard. I mean, there's some hope in the states, where the states are actually understanding this. But the power, the economic power, is still with the center. Political power has shifted to the states. And I think there is some hope in the new federalism, if that comes about.
If you look at the parts of India that are growing rapidly now, they're the Bimaru states, mostly.
Absolutely.
The formerly 6 states, like Madhya Pradesh, UP to some extent, Bihar to a great extent. And the way I think of it is they're kind of Indias within India. They're the easiest states to grow rapidly because they're so desperately misgoverned. They're so chronically kleptocratic that any sort of even mildly half-competent governance reform in a place like Patna is going to produce double-digit growth. If you can get girls going to school, any idiot can do this in theory on paper, but in practice it is surprisingly difficult. So if India's growth is increasingly being driven by the states that were just 10 years ago the ones that were dragging India down, I think you can start to see this in a slightly different. I appreciate everything you say about the fact that emerging markets only grow for a decade before they stop. But of course, the big counterexample to that is China.
Yes.
It's one country, but in terms of the proportion of people in the emerging market world, it's a huge share. So it's a very, very big counterexample to what you've been talking about. And if you were just to continue with the seeing the glass half full from India's point of view, what I would say about China is that it has a big deficit in the soft infrastructure things in which India excels, namely civil society, independent media, NGO sector, independent judiciary. I mean, India's judiciary is corrupt, but it is independent. And India has a chronically bad deficit in hard infrastructure, in the quality of its roads, airports, water systems, etc. If you were to ask which of those deficits, the hard infrastructure deficit or the soft infrastructure deficit, is more difficult to overcome, I'd say China's is more difficult. I'd say the China transition is quite a challenge.
But let me come back to what we were talking about, the fact that the action in the states, what you talked about, the Bimaru states now, but the action power in India is been shifting to the states, particularly in this coalition era of politics. And is that a good thing? And of course in China also, there's a huge amount of provincial autonomy. And the success of China, some people argue, is because of that it's not really a centralized communist authoritarian state which presses the button at the center. And so, it was curious to me that the latest law on FDI in retail, supermarkets, about which we've had a huge controversy, the law for the first time gives the states a veto to, if they don't want to implement the law, they don't have to. And this is this the direction? Is this the right direction? Because clearly if we have a weak center, we have strong, our chief ministers behave like presidents of countries. Whereas, Manmohan Singh is such a weak person at the center. And so what do you think? Is it a good thing, the new federalism?
I'm not sure it's so. It's stronger than it used to be. India has always been in fiscal terms, the most federal country in the world, as in the proportion of public spending that takes place at the state level versus the proportion that takes place at the center is higher in India than it is in Germany, the United States, Canada, Australia, other federal countries. And it is essential, I think, for Indian democracy and nationhood that it is a very federal country, precisely because it is such a diverse country. Having strong chief ministers in the states is a good thing for those states that are reforming. I think it's possible because you don't have coalition politics at the state. In most states, you can still have single-party rule. My concern about the relationship between the state and the center in an era of Congress government is that because Congress is dynastic, because Congress is essentially a royal family, they don't allow leaders to come up from the state level to the center. So you've got this awful situation where somebody of the stature and the experience of Digvijay Singh, for example, who was a very good, a very innovative chief minister of Madhya Pradesh, is essentially just a spokesman for Rahul Gandhi and the rest, for people who have no experience of government. And that's got to change if you're going to see competence at the center. I just sort of add one more point. Rahul Gandhi has had 10 years now, almost 10 years, to demonstrate that he understands India's problems. And, you know, I think I hear from people that he's a very nice man, and I've nothing personally against him, but I think the jury is back in. He doesn't understand the problems. He goes to these meetings and he gives the India whining spiel.
Yeah, I mean...
and it doesn't resonate. It doesn't resonate.
Ed, I was at a meeting that he was addressing in the last UP elections in not far from Delhi. And he was talking to, it was in a village, and he's talking about to the farmers about, oh, you poor fellow, you're doing your work is back-breaking in the hot sun, you don't even have a shirt in your back, and look at you, and look at what we have done for you. And then he catalogued the family right from his great-grandfather to today, and how we've given you Nariga, and we've given you this, and you poor victim. And you know, the audience in this village looked at each other. They all had cell phones. They were reasonably well dressed. They were young people who had aspirations. They didn't identify with Rahul Gandhi's Aam Aadmi. They were wondering, what is this Aam Aadmi that he's talking about? And what is the great gap today is that none of the political parties, you know, the BJP is really no better. They don't realize that the Aam Aadmi is changing, has changed, has aspirations. And the BJP also trots out this narrative of victimhood. Oh, you poor fellow, you're a victim of 1,000 years of Muslim invasions. The Dalits, the parties of the Dalits, they do the same thing. Oh, you're a victim of upper caste obsession. Same with the OBC parties. So what will it take, Ruchir, in 2014? Do we have a leader who can make us into a breakout nation?
Country, I think that there's too much obsession with national leaders. So, you know, whereas we go on talking about Rahul Gandhi, the fact of the matter is that if you look at state-by-state elections, you know, like, and I travel to these states every time there is an election in terms of what's going on out there. I've done 20 such election trips in India over the last 15 years or so with a group of people, that if you look at the state, that these national leaders are just not mattering that much. Like in, you know, we speak about UP. Rahul Gandhi was there, and the vote share that they have in UP has been declining consistently over time. In Bihar, same thing. Gujarat, same thing. So I think that, you know, like, for us to look for a national leader to transform this country, I don't think that's going to happen, because I don't think that's the way India is structured, you know, for us to throw that up. You know, like, the press is already sort of filled with this narrative now how the next election in 2014 is going to be a Rahul Gandhi versus Narendra Modi face-off. And I think that just totally misses the point. I mean, like, it misses the point, the fact that if you look at India's history, most prime ministers in our country, and especially outside the Gandhi family, everyone else, every single leader has been an accidental leader. which is that no one has been able to predict that this person will be prime minister, and they've yet become prime ministers. So the same thing, that the leader in 2014, I suspect, is going to be a dark horse lurking out there, who we don't know, and yet we have the hubris of trying to predict who the next prime minister is going to be.
Can Modi be the leader who can make us a breakout nation?
You see, I think there's a problem with that sort of thesis. And I think that the problem with Modi is this, which is the fact that, forget the, I know that it's a touchy subject and always get into trouble the moment we speak about him because he's so controversial, but here are the facts about Modi, which is why he faces such an uphill battle. That in India, all the national leaders who have emerged have never been strongly associated with the state. Because if you're strongly associated with the state, that reduces your national acceptability. And one of the strengths of the Gandhi family or of Vajpayee was the fact that they were never strongly associated with any state. So I think that's one thing he has to fight against. Now, Narendra Modi in the past has campaigned, albeit not in such a sort of big way, but he has campaigned in neighboring states, in Maharashtra, Madhya Pradesh. He's been taken to Rajasthan, even to other states. And in those states, in those constituencies also, if you do an analysis, his impact in terms of being able to swing votes for the BJP is zero, right? So his impact outside of Gujarat has so far in political terms on the ground been zero, because he's seen as far too much of a leader of one state. And here's the other sort of problem, I think, which is that I think that he's done a great job in Gujarat, and you can't argue against that. I just went to Gujarat in December, so if you see the development he's done in Gujarat, Gujarat is India's answer to China in many ways, but in both a good and a bad way. And here's the problem, that he's an authoritarian leader, and the problem with authoritarian leaders is that if they are heading in the right direction, it's fine. But by any chance, if they start heading in the wrong direction, there's no one to check them. There are no checks and balances. Because it's a one-man band, and I think that's as far as he's concerned. So, he's good as he can be for a while. But the problem with such dictatorial leaders is if they start going off in the wrong direction, they can end up being a Mugabe, like in Zimbabwe.
So, to both of you, is there a leader that we can see who can make India a breakout nation, get us back to sustainable 8% growth?
Look, I'm not going to predict a leader, and I would have some skepticism about the Caesar-like figure sort of hopes. I mean, it's almost a sign of desperation to be looking for that kind of person to be emerging. What I would say, though, is to go back to my previous point, and I don't wish to over-egg it too much, but if there is a lesson from the last 9 years of the UPA in power, it is that the person in charge of policy should also have the political control. To divide politics and policy in the way that, in a sort of diarchy that we've had with the UPA, is a recipe for power without accountability and accountability without power. And that's clearly not the way effective government happens. So I hope whatever dispensation emerges after the elections next year, I do very much hope, the first and fervent hope is that Modi has nothing to do with it. But beyond that, whatever dispensation emerges, you need the Prime Minister to be the person in charge of the politics. And I guess that would probably logically point to Rahul Gandhi. So that's not going to be your Caesarean figure.
Well, not Caesarean figure, but we are looking, I'm not sure we're looking for a Caesarean figure. At this stage in our history, our fundamental issue is governance. Mm-hmm. It's the reform of our institutions. Indeed. The bureaucracy, the police, the judiciary. And really, it's to provide public goods. I mean, the Nirbhaya incident and the Anna Hazare movement, what they show to me is that for the first time, we're talking about in our politics, and the politicians are getting this message, that people want goods that benefit everybody. Good law and order benefits everybody. Good, how you treat women, how you protect women affects everybody. Whereas the political class has been obsessed with sectional interests, with reservations for this section, with Nariga jobs for this section, with free power for farmers, and so on. So for the first time, instead of, seems to be a demand emerging, which the politicians, I mean, they're smart. They also hear it. And if they get the message that really votes lie in goods which affect everybody, there could be it. And so, first, that is there a leader who is capable of doing the kind of institutional reform that we need? I mean, not just economic reform, but the institutional reform.
Yeah.
Is there?
You want a name?
Well, yeah,
I mean,
it would help.
you mentioned, I attended your session yesterday, and this is a coincidence, but I reviewed your book, and my review, your excellent book, by the way, and my review appears in today's FT, and wasn't trying to butter you up, but it's just a coincidence. I agree with the point you make in your book, that as India becomes more middle class, and the point you made in your session yesterday, that we're used to politics of narrow caste, linguistic, social protest and grievance in India. There's an old phrase from the colonial times that the British rule, Indians divide. And I think, if India has, you mentioned India's key word is Dharma, and that it's liberty for America, égalité for France, Dharma for India. I would suggest it's plurality as well. I think Dharma's a good one. Plurality might be a contender, and that makes governance a lot more difficult. And the point that you made in your session yesterday, that the Anna Hazare movement was actually a movement of broad-based citizens, not a caste-based movement seeking public goods that would benefit everybody, reduced corruption, more government transparency, etc., was flawed only in one sense, which is its leader. To get to your point, its leader was the wrong leader. A man like Anna Hazare, who talked about lashing people who drink, alcoholics, cutting their hands off others. You're not going to win over the media by talking about cutting people's hands off for drinking. Journalists need their fingers to meet deadlines.
Yeah.
And so if you'd had, accident threw up a very odd, idiosyncratic leader in the form of Anna Hazare. If you'd had a better leader last year, or the year before last, for that movement, a lot more could have happened. So, I mean, I accept your point.
Yeah.
Leaders do matter.
Yeah.
I just don't have any names for you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this obsession with coming up with a central leader is what we need to end. I don't think that we're going to get a central leader. Instead, what we're going to get in this country are a set of breakout leaders at the state level, and that's going to make the difference. And at a state level, that's happening. This link between politics and development is sort of increasingly clear. So, I mean, you look at India today, there are 6 chief ministers in this country today who have won a term now 3 times. 6. 2 decades ago, there was 1 chief minister only who had won a term 3 times. Because, like in India, the rule used to be that, the favorite sort of image of this I had was that at the end of every Lok Sabha session, they have a photograph of all the members. And when a member used to stand there, he used to say that I hope the guy on the left and the guy on the right don't come back, because if they do, the chances of me coming back are 0. Because the probability really was that only 1 out of 3 leaders would get re-elected.
Yeah.
So that was the old sort of politics of cynicism, which is that somebody would get the caste right, some equation right, be able to win an election, but the performance was so poor on the ground that they'd get booted out the next time.
And Ruchir, you have a good point, because the fact is that India is doing still reasonably well because the action is in the states.
Yes.
And some states have been really driving. But, when you look at the government's budget, you see how much power, political power may be in the states, but economic center still has a lot of economic power, and its ability to stop states, such as labor reform.
Yeah, environment.
Environment.
Exactly.
Why should it take 8 years to get a license for a steel plant?
Yes.
And that's what Ratan Tata said on the day that he retired. And so, whether we like it or not, it's very important who is in 2014.
But that's why I'm not scared of coalition governments, because I think that if you get coalition governments dictated by, with more and more state leaders in that mix, they will shift that power when they are when they are in Delhi. So as more of them get to Delhi, they will shift that power systematically to the states. Now you mentioned retail FDI. But the reason that happened was because a lot of the state leaders, that's the only way that they would sort of back it. So I think as the politics of India shifts, and as the political power is shifted, the economic power will also keep shifting to the states. So it's a matter of time. So therefore I think that that's the model for me for India, which is that this dream, that at the center we can present one or two dream budgets, and all of a sudden we can get back to 8-9% economic growth. I think those expectations are misplaced. Instead, the way it's going to function is that we gradually move back up as the power moves more and more to the states, more breakout states emerge in this country, and that lifts the national average up. So it's more a bottom-up model rather than a top-down model.
And that's historically, as you said, it's been how India has been.
Has evolved.
That we were always a country of competing kingdoms.
Exactly.
Unlike China, which had empires.
That's right.
So we never had, well, we had 4 empires in our history.
But, like in the 17th century, at the peak of our economic power, when we controlled apparently 20 to 25% of the economic output, that's exactly how we functioned. This heavily centralized model is something which came after British rule and something which came post-independence. Otherwise, India's natural social fabric is one which is a collection of states, not a centralized homogeneous entity.
So Ed, the question is, if we need to do these governance reforms, I mean, I personally think that we will get to be a middle income country. I think up till 2030 the narrative is reasonably secure in my view.
But then we won't be here to know whether you're right or wrong, right?
Well, that may well be true. That's my prediction.
To be fair, Ruchir, the 50-50 is a pretty hedged prediction as well.
So I personally think that we will get to that level, but then we'll get stuck. We'll get stuck in this middle income trap, as the Latin Americans stuck, just as China will get stuck unless it fixes its politics before that. So in this narrative of a new federalism that we are talking about, where the states are driving prosperity, you still need to do these governance reforms. And these reforms have to be of many central institutions, like the judiciary, like the answers are all there. I mean, we've had umpteen reports on how to reform the police, how to reform the judiciary, how to reform the bureaucracy.
And some of it's happening. I mean, the right to information law, I think, was a crucially important reform that's come out of the UPA. Now, I know there have been problems with it. I know it's not fully implemented. I know it's even inhibited, anecdotal reports say it's even inhibited action and execution on the parts of bureaucrats because it reduces their corruption opportunities. I understand all of that. But that is actually the kind of law that will look bigger over time.
Yeah, but you know, Ed, I'm sorry, but the fact is that today, why should it take us 12, 15 years to get justice in the court? Why should it take us 10, 12 years to build a road, which we know can be built in 3 years?
The title of your book comes, correct me if I'm wrong, from Italy. The economy grows at night while the government is sleeping. Now, Italy, without reforming its state, it still remains the most corrupt, porous, easily hijackable state in Europe, in Western Europe at any rate. Was the economic miracle of Europe in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, and it overtook Britain in the 80s. It's since been re-overtaken by Britain, which takes some doing, so it's not quite such a good story anymore. But it was able to do that with large parts of the country essentially being controlled by organized crime, and still large parts are controlled by organized crime.
We don't want to be
But
like
I'm trying to be
country.
realistic. I'm trying to be realistic here about what you can achieve in India. You're not going to get Swedish-style institutions of state in India anytime within our lifetimes. That's a safe prediction to make, I think.
So you don't think that governance reforms
I think they're very
possible?
I think they are essential. But I don't think that you can achieve as much as you might hope you can with them.
You know, a bureaucrat today, did you know that in the IAS, 4 out of 5 officers are today rated as either outstanding or above average?
Grade inflation.
4 out of 5.
I would-
They get a rating of 4 out of 5 as the average. Now we know no organization
That's
has
right.
that. And the rule of seniority is so entrenched.
And as you pointed out in your book, Manmohan Singh attempted to change this,
Yeah.
and then they said boo, and then he retreated.
So we
it was,
need
it
a-
was sabotaged.
So we need a leader when you say boo, doesn't retreat.
But you know
True.
something,
Well,
Gurcharan,
no,
I think
I agree with you.
Yeah, but like I want to mention here that one of the lessons, at least, that we have learned, and this is something I feel strongly about, is that there is no magic bullet for growth. So let's not emphasize just one point. In terms of what creates growth is a multiple factors.
Yeah.
Like, for example, some people talk about institutions being a great, sort of thing for growth.
Right.
And what we've seen in China is that had you focused too much on institutions, you would have missed a lot of the economic boom of the last 20 to 30 years because the quality of institutions in China is not great. We know that. I mean, in terms of redressal systems in China are very weak. Similarly, some people sort of focus on geography. Some people focus on culture. Some people focus on a leader. So my entire point is that there is no one factor which leads to economic miracles. Those factors vary over time, and it's a mix of factors. So let's not get obsessed with just one factor. It really sort of is a multitude
Right.
of factors here.
Right. Well, we are all seeking always, given the sort of angst we feel,
Yeah.
we're always seeking either a leader or or one thing. And but I think it's now time for us to throw this debate to the audience, and lots of hands have come up. And in fact, let's begin at the back instead of at the front. Some of the people at the back, do we have microphones that we can take down to some of the people who have raised their hands?
It's a long way back there.
Huh? Okay, and then we'll just take quickly, please make your question short so that everybody can ask, can I
hello.
get a chance?
We have a
My
second
question
mic.
is,
Just go down the aisle a little
for
bit,
you all.
please.
For the second
you.
term for Barack Obama, his key focus for India is getting 170 million farmers from agriculture into manufacturing. Now, okay, there will be progress, but at the cost of what? And since you took out the example of Gujarat, I would like to say that there is another Gujarat. Gujarat is progressing, there is no doubt about it, but there is another Gujarat where the farmers, if you see, the most number of farmer suicide is in Gujarat. And my question is, do we need to define what progress is? I mean, in the terms
Okay,
of...
does anybody want to...
And the social development, the human development
Yeah, that is
indicators
what I'm
for
asking.
Gujarat are not nearly as good
Yeah. But
as
yes,
the
the
economic
first question-
investment.
And it is the
That's absolutely right.
it is the state that has received the highest number of FDI.
Yeah.
So if
Okay.
that is what FDI is doing, I mean, should we redefine what we know as progress?
Okay, very good question. Ruchir, do you want to take the first question, or the first question, which was really the soft underbelly, which is a very good question, that the soft underbelly of India is that we have not had an industrial revolution, a manufacturing revolution. We seem to have jumped from a green revolution right to a services
That's right.
kind of
No, I think
revolution.
that is a sort of fundamental flaw, because if you look at all the big economic miracle stories defined as 8 to 9% growth, they were all done through manufacturing. And they were done through manufacturing, apart from some commodity countries which did it for a while, but all
Yeah.
sort of other countries did it through manufacturing, because manufacturing creates the maximum amount of employment in terms of the intensity.
Right.
For manufacturing, employment is the highest. So this remains a problem in India, that last 20 to 30 years, amazingly, the share of manufacturing in our economy has been stagnant at about 15% or so. In miracle economies, the share of manufacturing in the economy tends to be about 25–30%.
Right.
So that to me remains a fundamental problem, and one of the reasons why India has not been able to sustain growth of 8 to 9%.
So what do we have to do?
Well, the concern, I mean, to sort of link the two parts of the question, the
No,
concern,
I
and
was
we
saying,
were,
let's go with the first part of the question.
well, we were talking about this earlier. I mean, half of India, more than half of India is employed in agriculture, but it's only 15% of the Indian economy, the agricultural sector. So it's clear India to grow has got to pick up on productivity. It's clear where the productivity gains are going to have to be in agriculture. And my great concern is that that's going to involve people moving from agriculture into other sectors.
Right.
Whatever form the agricultural reform takes, that's going to involve pushing people from agriculture into what? If manufacturing isn't ready, if it isn't expanding, if they haven't been trained for the shop floor, then you're going to get a lot of young people, as you already do, but you're going to get growing numbers of young people
So what's the
seeking
answer,
jobs.
though?
I think the answer is the kinds of reforms that we're all very, very familiar with. The neoliberal reforms to make it easier to hire and fire, to build better infrastructure, to have better skills training, all the sort of really plain vanilla stuff with which we can cite in our sleep.
Right. Okay. Can we go to the next question, please?
There was a mention of federation and about retail going, the option being given to states. But the new trend about the new financial GST, etc. coming up, will it give back to states anything? And how it will be modeled, how it will fit the...
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I personally am very optimistic about GST. I think it will do both. It will actually give a lot to the states. And a lot of the inefficiencies today that the states face is because of the lack of a GST, the lack actually of a common market in India, where you have these the sort of the tax system creates incentives for the states to behave in inefficient ways, and I think that's personally. Do you have any thoughts on GST, either of you?
No, I think what you
Okay.
said is covered the
So
ground.
let's
Yeah.
move to the next question.
Yeah.
It doesn't threaten federalism. That's what I was, the bottom line.
There's a couple of points to all three, and if you can answer them. I mean, are you suggesting a change of the democratic pattern of India to a presidential pattern?
To what?
To a presidential pattern? Or,
Good
and how do you get strong leaders without, in a coalition who has a good population base, but, is still, universally acceptable? And why aren't corporate leaders who have a great experience in running big corporations or big companies take the center stage in governance?
Very good question.
Yeah, I think that, regarding presidential system, I really don't feel that's going to work in India for all the reasons that I just said, that the natural social fabric of this country is one which requires sort of, much more state level kind of leaders. Talking about, why don't we have enough corporate CEOs? Across the world, by the way, we have seen that very rarely do CEOs of corporations make good political leaders. The translation of that is very poor. Having said that, if you look at the way these successful chief ministers operate, they really function like CEOs of their states, which is that they're all very autocratic, very focused, and also the fact that they don't sort of rely much on their other sort of people in politics, but a lot on technocrats in the state to try and execute. That's the common model for all these people.
Well,
and I think that is the real sort of message, that we have these state leaders functioning like CEOs in this country.
Excellent, excellent question, excellent answer. Okay, who's next?
The lady down there.
A quick question. A growth model which I think we were discussing based upon strong state leaders, doesn't it also have hinge on the fact which I think Gurcharan has written in his book, that every state leader also has a siloed political agenda? So if they go to the center, if you have a Mulayam, Mamta and a Mayawati at the center, with the economic power which is shifting to them, they will want reservation, they will want to keep agricultural land intact, they will want perhaps certain other things, including Bihar First agenda. So is that not somewhere needs to be discussed more or something?
Yeah, I think that's a relevant point, but here's the thing, that firstly, like, not all state leaders are great, in terms of the fact that if you look at the results, they vary quite a bit. It depends as to who the leaders are. And you're right that they may have their own personal agendas that they want to, sort of propagate, but nobody's powerful enough to do it, just in favor of their state. So no, so when we had Dev Gowda in power, he didn't sort of do great things for the state of Karnataka. So I think when they get to the center, and the other
But
thing
we
is,
had the dream budget
with the dream budget under him.
Under
Exactly.
Deva Gowda.
Like, I mean, one of the best budgets in '97 was under him.
Right.
And I think that the other sort of point here is the fact that these these state leaders are also kept in check by each other. That's the real sort of thing. And this coalition government is very true in many countries in Europe too, which sort of have a diverse society. So we spoke about Italy, we spoke about France, we spoke about Germany. They all have coalition governments because that's the way the nature of their countries is.
Right. Okay. Can we have a question towards the back? Yes.
Yes. I'll address it to Ruchir. Specifically, you can join otherwise. A very limited question. I have been part of the government for almost 40 years. I've seen all the
So please hold, can you please hold the mic to you? Yeah.
Now, this ever-present controversy between the finance ministry and the RBI, each blaming the other and all, etc. I mean, very recently, FM said we'll carry the growth agenda ourselves if RBI doesn't cooperate and all, etc. Why can't we have an unambiguous, unequivocal sort of objective like the Bank of England, that you hold inflation down? Let the fisc do the other things.
Very good
Ruchir first, and maybe Gurcharan can join in later.
Yeah. I think that's a very, very good question, and question that we've all been talking about for the last year or 2 years.
No, I think that's absolutely true that, I mean, like as we move towards this more federal structure, we're going to need more of these rules. So I think that we're going to need, I think that the best thing that can happen to India is if we agree on an, I know this is a bit sort of technocratic, but if we can agree on an inflation target rule for India, that the inflation is going to be 5%. I think an inflation target rule for India will be very good for this country. That one of the biggest sort of fallbacks of this country the last 3 years, there's been so much talk about growth, but I think not about how much we have slipped on inflation. And we do an inflation ranking of countries across the world of about 180 odd economies. Yeah. India's ranking on inflation for the last 30 years or so was very stable. It was middle of the pack. That India's inflation rate would be middle of the pack of all the countries. Last 2 to 3 years, India's inflation ranking out of 180, 150 to 160. So I think that, not enough focus on inflation.
Yeah, and it's, I think one of the sad things, frankly, that because what inflation has done is it has affected growth. There's no question about it, but it's affected policy. We are a domestically driven economy. We are a consumer-driven economy, and a domestically driven consumer economy needs low interest rates. And low interest rates, high interest rates have killed our growth story.
That's right.
And so it's tragic. But at the same time, the Reserve Bank is got this sort of dilemma of Hamlet.
But having said that, let's give them some credit that they have stood up to the finance minister. That repeatedly, even though the mandate is not clear and they report into the finance ministry,
right,
they have, whenever the governor takes the seat, I mean, he sort of stands up, it seems.
And we need more regulators like that.
Like that. Mm-hmm.
And that's one of the deficits, but in terms of the economic policy making or structures, that when you talk institutions, really our regulators, there's a lot to be desired. Okay, we've got somebody right in front.
I want to ask about the FDI and retail. So, the Trinamool Congress recently resigned from the UPA coalition, Arun Roy, Mukul Roy. So I want to ask if is FDI and retail beneficial or not?
Let me give you a very short and answer which will make sense to you. Now, you buy tomatoes at 20 rupees a kilo, but the farmer gets only 5 or 4 rupees. So that's a gap of 1:4, 1:5. And the reason why this big gap is there is because there are many layers that the farmer has to take his tomatoes to the mandi. The arhatia is the commission agent who has to get his commission. Then a wholesaler gets his commission. then the retailer gets his commission, then the rediwala gets his commission before they reach you. And so if supermarkets come, they buy from the farmer and they sell to you. So they can pay to the farmer 8 rupees, and to you they can charge 16 rupees, which is 1:2. And in countries where you have supermarkets, typically this gap has shrunk. So everybody gains, the consumer with low prices and the farmers with better returns.
Sir?
Yeah.
Sir, here. Here.
Okay. I can't see you. Oh, there, I can see you.
सर मैं ये पूछ रही हूँ कि जब कोई गवर्नमेंट हार जाती है और जो जीत जाती है, तो जो हारने वाली टीम है, जो पार्टी है, वो सिर्फ एंटी में ही काम करेगी, बदला भावना से ही काम करेगी, वो वापस कॉमन पीपल के लिए अपने ग्राउंड पे काम क्यों नहीं करती है? क्योंकि नक्सलिज्म, जातिवाद, क्षेत्रवाद ये एक दिन या एक रात में नहीं बना, और आज हमारे सामने इतनी बड़ी प्रॉब्लम आ गई, तो आज हमारा सेंटर और स्टेट सब धाराशायी होते हुए नजर आते हैं।
ये बहुत अच्छा सवाल है।
हमें मतलब भारी, मेरा मतलब
समझ गया आपका सवाल, और बिल्कुल सही बात है कि जो यही तो एक पॉलिटिकल ग्रिडलॉक जैसे हो जाता है। When the BJP was in power, Congress opposed almost everything that the BJP wanted to do, which were the reforms. You were here that time. Now, Congress wants to do the reform, BJP will stop them. And this kind of opposition behavior, you know, the American founding fathers were very concerned with this kind of behavior when they first, you know, the Federalist Papers. And they called them factions, and they thought they were very destructive, and therefore you needed a strong executive. That's why they opted for a strong president, partly. Now, you're absolutely right that, but how do we get, I don't know, how do we get the opposition party not to oppose for the sake of opposition?
But as Ed will tell you that in the US they have the same problems. I think this is a universal democratic sort of problem
it's
today.
It's a disease of democracy.
And, it was actually a weak presidency they set up. I mean, they didn't want George III to come back through executive power.
That's true.
You know, you, again, to cite your book, simply because it's not just because it's good, but because it's freshest in my memory, the ways of defragmenting Indian politics. It's not directly response to the question, but the ways of defragmenting Indian politics, one of which is to have a threshold. You need a minimum percentage of the national vote to get representation. Germany has it. If you get below 5%, you don't get representation. There are ways of doing things which,
France has a runoff,
short of presidentializing the system, that could produce really quite far-reaching improvements, and that parties in opposition and in government can agree to.
Okay, let's...
just a last question.
We have time for one more after that.
I just want to know whether is India's sluggish growth story just to do with this basic and fundamental theory that high growth is just not sustainable in the long run? And if that is so, how did China beat this theory? Or is it because India's growth story is just not inclusive enough?
Yeah, I think, you know, like I've done some sort of statistics on this, and the fact of the matter is that the probability reduces with time. That the higher growth rate, the probability of you sustaining it reduces. For example, in any particular decade in the last 50, 100 years, about 1/3 of economies in the world have been able to grow at 5% or more for a decade. The probability that they can sustain that for a second decade goes down to 1/4. Third decade it goes down to, in fact, 1/10. And only 2 economies in the world were able to sustain growth rate of 5% or more for 5 decades, those being Korea and Taiwan. So yes, there will be exceptions, but the rule is that the longer you sustain high growth, the harder it becomes to sustain it further. So
but Ruchir, India has sustained also high growth above 5% for 3 decades.
That's right. So but I'm saying that it depends as to what's your line. I think in India's case, the line that we're looking at is China, that why did China sustain it at 8 to 9% for 3 decades, and why have we been able to and why did we were able to do it only for a 5-6 year period? So I think that is the difference.
Okay, I've just been told that
I would like...
I know there's such lovely questions that are...
Sir, the last question. You see...
Okay, last question.
So I am raising certain points See, Modi's importance is being unnecessarily exaggerated. Performance of Gujarat was better even before 2001. In present Indian states, it is Chhattisgarh which is doing better than any other state. One thing. Then the main problem is governance. Nuclear agreement was opposed by BJP, which wanted to pass the nuclear agreement when they were in power. Manmohan Singh wanted to denationalize Coal India. He couldn't do it. He wanted to auction coal blocks 22 times. He couldn't do it. He was opposed by congressmen. He was opposed by BJP chief minister. Both Congress and BJP. So basic problem is governance. Which party does what? We cannot, you see, for you Congress, we cannot for you BJP. They are the two mainly responsible parties, especially GST. The BJP chief ministers, Mr. Gurcharan, are opposing it now, which is very harmful for our country.
Okay.
They should support it.
Okay, I think this is this was not a question, fortunately, and we have run out of time.
Can I ask the last question because I raised the hand first?
Do we have? I don't think so. I'm being told.
Okay.
Sorry.
No problem.
We can talk just after this.
No, yeah, I'll speak with Ruchir and you later on that.
Okay. Yeah.
All right, thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you all so much. Thank you for this wonderful session. And I must thank the audience for some excellent questions. This is exactly the kind of thing we should be discussing on Republic Day. So thank you all, and please accept a token of our thanks. The authors will be signing books. If you do want to interact with them, chat with them and get books signed, they will all be at the book signing area near those umbrellas at the back of the lawn, so please make your way there.